Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Anything that anybody has left over from last time that you wanted to ask about or get clarity? Hey, Bob, welcome. Nice to see you. All right, so I actually had picked out 6 of the women mystics, but I only got around to coming up with 4 biographies and selections and stuff. So there are, dozens that you could look at. And so these are just sort of examples that we're going to be talking about today of a phenomenon that really particularly was characteristic of like the 11th and 12th centuries, that these the things that were going on in the church made kind of an opening that these women were filling. And do you, Angie, can you give Peggy permission to share the screen so that she has a couple of images for Hildegard that we might put up? Or maybe she's gone. See if I can do it.
Well, maybe she can just put them on her screen. We won't see her Peggy's face for a while.
You mean just hold them up to the camera?
Yeah, I don't know what they are, so that will.
Yeah, maybe not. I can't even share my screen, so I can't.
I only have them digitally. I don't have a printout of the image.
Right. Well, they're actually fairly easy to find if you Google them, but
yeah.
But there are a number of images from Hildegard's books that she composed herself. So she was sort of polymath, if not Renaissance woman, because she's really earlier than the Renaissance. But she's her dates are 1098, right at the end of the 11th century, to 1117. And she is remembered for a number of different skills that she had. She's regarded as one of the first women composers whose work remains to us. Yes, Anna.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go
you
ahead.
said 1098 to 1117?
1179.
I was going to say that's not very many years.
Yeah, no.
And the other thing is, I don't think you know this, but so the way you're seated, your mouth goes toward the corner of your microphone, and when you start talking that direction, your voice goes out.
Okay, all right. I'll try not to do that. It's having the cat in the lap, and I think he's leaving. So hopefully, I can be a little more straightforward. Hildegard is an example of a woman who really takes advantage of the opportunity of religious community as a source of hierarchical power within the church. And she becomes an abbess. She's a Benedictine abbess. So she's really in charge of a convent and ultimately of several convents, because she has such a following. She has to start new ones after a while. But originally, she's the 10th child in her family. And there was kind of a tradition of the 10th child being regarded as a tithe and therefore dedicated to the church. And so she is actually sent at the age of 8, I guess, it was, to stay with a family cousin who is also a devout woman who ultimately is going to be enclosed, and we'll talk about more about what that means. But lots of kids actually were sent from their families of origin, often to their extended families or other family connections, to be trained in a trade or whatever their eventual destiny was going to be. So with boys, it was often an apprenticeship, you know, that you would be sent out to work with some expert in the field that you were going into. And then when you were old enough, you would perhaps go into business with that person or be recommended by them to a guild, or they would somehow launch you. If you were a noble family, you might be the squire to a knight who could then sponsor you for knighthood yourself, all those kinds of things. So it was not unusual for children to move out of their native family and into some larger family unit. And that happened with girls too, generally, who were going into domestic service, who were going to be either housewives themselves or servants in some larger household, that they too would go out for training because perhaps their own mother had other kids to deal with, which certainly would have been the case with Hildegard if she was number 10. So she was sent to live with this female mentor, and they became connected with this Celtic monastery near Disabodienberg. And there is actually a saint, Disabod, or Disabod, I guess you would say. And so the city was really the locus of where his monastery was established. He was an Irish monk who became a saint, so he established this Celtic monastery. And so her mentor, this woman that she was sent to live with when she was 8, decided to become an anchoress, decided to be enclosed near this monastery. And my sense is that what happened was Hildegard was sent there to be her servant, to be her liaison to the outside world, because we'll talk some more when we come to Julian about what it means to be enclosed. But basically, you're living in this cell or this room that's built onto the church, and you don't leave. If you're the anchoress, if you're the enclosed person, the idea is you live the rest of your life in that room. That's what it means to be enclosed in prayer. And the idea is it's an Eremitic practice. It's kind of the way for women to be a hermit, because women cannot just go out and live in the desert because they're not safe to do that. They will be abused if they do that. And particularly urban women don't have a desert to go out to. And so this is kind of the way of achieving that is you have this little room not right next to the church, and you never leave. So in order for that to work, you have to have a servant. You have to have someone who brings you food and brings you writing materials and, takes away your waste and whatever, helps you maintain yourself in that status. So that's my theory about what happened with Hildegard is she is this woman's liaison person. But eventually they begin to attract other followers who think that their type of piety, that their religious practice is attractive. And when you consider the options that were available to women, if you really weren't that enthusiastic about the idea of getting married by the time you were 15, this was one of the few options that you had. So eventually the mentor dies. She reaches the end of her life. And at that point, Hildegard says, what we really have here is a convent. We really have a monastic community. And let's go actually find a facility where we can all live together and practice as a community of religious women. Now that the monks who ran the convent at Disabodenberg were not that enthusiastic about the idea of them leaving, because actually they were part of what was renowned about the monastery. And so they actually, Hildegard actually had to go on a fast and get ill until they finally the bishop said, oh, let her go. And so they had to let her go. But so then they moved, and I don't think I wrote down where they went, but well, they went to a sort of ruined monastery near Bingen, which is how she becomes Hildegard of Bingen. And they kind of restored the place. They built it up again so that it would be a place where they could live in community. And one of the things that's notable about Hildegard is she is an artist in a number of ways. She writes music, she writes poetry, she writes plays, and she paints, she illustrates her books. So she has, she's also an herbalist. She also is a practitioner of women's medicine, which she didn't have formal medical training, which in that day and age actually was probably a good thing, if you actually wanted to get better. But so she writes about the practice of medicine as from the practical viewpoint of actually healing people, and talking about what kinds of treatments actually do good. And this is something that comes about both from being in charge of these communities of women where people obviously got ill and you had to have address their medical needs in the community, but then they also, it was part of their practice of mercy and charity to the public that they would help people who were ill. And if you think about the plague years, that there was a lot of that. And so they had a lot of opportunity to serve the medical needs of the public. So she writes about that as well. But one of the first things is a really charming, if you ever get a chance to take a look at it, a musical play, basically, that she writes for the nuns in the convent, which is kind of an allegorical story about the soul looking for salvation. And all of the women who are in the play represent the different virtues that help the soul on the way to salvation. And they have dialogues with the soul. And there's only one male role in the play, which was played by their confessor, and he gets to be Satan. So he's the one who's always arguing against what it is that they need to do for their salvation. Interestingly, he doesn't get to sing. The virtues all have songs that they sing to the soul, but all he ever does is yell. I think it must have been a very sympathetic priest that they had who was willing to play that role. One of the interesting things about her writing is she's one of the first people to begin the description of purgatory as a separate realm, a specific place that people go to. And this is a whole concept that is kind of growing up within the Catholic Church around the turn of the millennium, that there has always been the question, since all the way back in the time when Jesus was supposed to be coming soon, right? As soon as there was a generation of folks that had died without Jesus returning, the question was, were they in fact in heaven, having already been judged for the quality of their life? Or was everybody just kind of asleep, waiting for Jesus to return, at which time everyone would be judged? You see the difference between those two things? And there are very original, all the way back to the catacombs in Rome, inscriptions that are prayers for the dead. But normally the early ones are prayers for peace for that person's soul. They're looking for, let eternal light shine on them. You know, it's not, the assumption is not that they are conscious somewhere, but then there starts to be the assumption that, well, if you're praying for these people, it must be because they are having some kind of experience right now. And that's because that's the only way that your prayers could actually do them any good. So this idea begins to arrive that, well, you know, we know, and the other piece that influences this is the argument about baptism, because if you remember, like Constantine, he wants to wait until the end of his life to get baptized because he doesn't want there to be any chance between the time of his baptism and when he dies that he could go out and commit more sins, right? Because at that time there wasn't a concept of what you do about that. The baptism was your one-shot opportunity to wipe it all away. Well, now by the 10th or 11th century, you have lots of people who are getting baptized as infants. So we know that they're going to commit sins. And so we have the penance and we have rituals around that. But then, you know, you could be absolved and you could go have participate in the mass, and then you could go out and potentially do a sin, you know, and then what if you died? So therefore you have the last rites, you know, you have that at the moment when we think you're going to die, we're going to do this one more time, you know, and try to catch up with everything that you might have done since the last time you got all your sins fixed up. But people died all the time without having that opportunity, right? And so then the question was, well, what happens to you if you die and there are sins on your soul that you have not had the opportunity to atone for? Okay, so you put those two things together, and what you say is, okay, well, Jesus hasn't come yet, but maybe the souls of the dead that have the potential to be saved are in some sort of state of consciousness where they can be taking care of that last bit of sinfulness that they didn't have a chance to get rid of right before they died, right? So that becomes the idea of purgatory, that this is a place where you are purged of whatever sinfulness you didn't have a chance to atone for in life. And that's a very comforting notion, because all these people that we care about, right, that, and we know, you know, that Uncle Joe had a few things on his conscience, or should have, that God was not going to be happy about. So as an alternative to thinking, well, you know, that's it for Joe, he's going to hell, you can think, well, you know, if he believed in the mercy of God, if he believed in Jesus, then maybe he's in this place where he's having this opportunity to suffer in a redemptive kind of way that will enable his soul, then by the time Jesus comes, he'll be ready, you know, he'll be in a fit state to be judged as worthy of going to heaven. Yes, Anna.
So when did hell start? I mean, hell came first and then this
hell comes first. Yes.
So they used to go straight there, but now they have this chance.
Well, no, see, the question was, were you anywhere, right? Were you, because if one option was to go straight to heaven, then presumably the other option was to go straight to hell, right? And there did start to be, and this is also kind of a medieval concept, but you see it, and Peggy, you may know some examples, but like in cathedral carvings and stuff, sometimes you see the parade of people, right, on the way to hell, and the the devils are, you know, like taking them away to torment. So that was one idea, that, you know, the saved went right to heaven and the damned went right to hell. But that's pretty stark, you know, there's no second chance at that point. So then there's the other idea, which is, no, we're all waiting for Jesus to come, and then we're going to be judged. And maybe then the devils will take all the bad people to hell and all the good people will go to heaven. But in the meantime, while we're waiting, it might be that a soul that has something left to make up for can kind of do this remedial class, you know, this remedial suffering, and be purged of their guilt in the same way that they would have been if they'd been able to confess and be absolved and, you know, do atonement stuff in life. So it's kind of the second chance. And part of the appeal of that idea was that, okay, well, we know Uncle Joe was suffering in purgatory because he had all this stuff on his conscience. Now it makes sense to pray for him. Now it makes sense that there is something we can do to make things easier, that by saying prayers for him and ultimately by having masses said for his soul, we can shorten the extent of that time. We can reduce the amount of suffering that he's going to undergo. And we also have evolved this idea, right, of indulgences, that the Pope has said, you know, if you go on crusade, or if you build a cathedral, or if you do these things for the church, then that will reduce, in advance, on spec, that will reduce the time that you're going to spend in purgatory, just in case you die with any problems with your soul. So now it makes perfect sense for me to say, well, if I can earn or buy indulgences for myself, how about if I build you a cathedral, but I say, please apply that indulgence to Uncle Joe, who I know is in purgatory, right? Because I don't think I'm going to need it, but I do think he needs it, right? Well, this is great for the church because they get all the benefit, and the marginal cost of getting a soul out of purgatory is nothing for the church in this world, right? You know, I mean, there is no investment that has to be made in that other than printing up some forms and filling them in that say you got this indulgence. But you can even just go to your local church and pay money to have a mass said for Uncle Joe, or prayers, you know, go to the local abbey or the local convent and pay them to say prayers for Uncle Joe and help him out in purgatory that way. So this is particularly appealing to women, because women can't go fight in crusades, and women often don't have access to significant chunks of money that they can pay to build a cathedral or endow masses or whatever, but they can pray. You know, that's something that women can do. They themselves can say prayers for the dead. And so that's it's a piece of power that women have that they can use for the benefit of people that they care about in the religious realm. So and this again is particularly relevant to the vowed religious life, to people who are in convents and monasteries, who are sometimes accused of not being useful, you know, to the rest of society. Well, they're not having children, and they're not, you know, they're not doing anything to help the community. Well, now they can argue, well, sure we are, because all of our prayers are being said for the benefit of the souls in purgatory. And particularly if you want to argue that, well, we are living in a pious religious community, we really don't have that much opportunity to sin, and we have constant access to the mechanisms for forgiveness, even if we do, you know, I mean, it's easy for us to go to confession. It's easy for us to receive the sacrament. There's always going to be someone around who can give us the sacrament of the sick, if we are in a position where we're likely to die. We're probably not, you know, out doing heavy labor where a big piece of marble is going to fall on us. We're probably not out fighting in wars where someone's likely to stab us to death. You know, we're not doing some of the dangerous things that would put people in normal life at risk of dying without absolution. You know, if we get sick, we're likely to lay around in the monastery for a while, and there'll be time for the priest to come and do those last rites and get us safely to heaven without needing to go through purgatory because we've confessed everything. Now, of course, there's always the possibility that you didn't actually confess everything. And so you might wind up in purgatory anyway because you hadn't totally realized all your sins or hadn't wanted to admit them in life. So you still have to suffer for those ones that you never talked about. So there are, as you might remember, the whole calendar of the year is filled with saints' days, right? At this point, there are more saints than there are days in the year, so they often have to double up. But you're celebrating those saints and their particular miracles and their particular martyrdoms, and you're praying to them on their days, their designated days. And there start to be, particularly in monasteries, what's called All Saints Day, which is like any other saint, or any of the saints. You know, we're going to honor them all. We're going to pray to them all. We're going to ask mercy from them all on All Saints Day, right? Because you might miss somebody, you know, or you might have been busy that day when your patron saint was honored, or, you know, there's some virtue in saying everybody in the pool, you know, we're going to honor all the saints. So then the next logical move after that was to say, okay, we have these endowed masses, we have these prayers that people have paid for, but part of our mission as a religious community is to help people that no one else wants to help, right? To help the poor. And one of the ways in which we can do that is to help the poor people who died without absolution, who are now in purgatory, who don't have anybody in specific to pray for them or to endow masses for them or to buy them some sort of indulgence. So those became All Souls Day. That was the day on which we are going to try to benefit all the souls in purgatory, all the ones we don't know their names, we haven't specifically identified them. This is for everybody. And that begins in the monastic life, in convents and monasteries, in the 9th and 10th centuries. So that, and it fits in with this idea of all the unknown people who might be in purgatory and are praying for their release or for the shortening of their suffering. And Hildegard is one of the first people who actually talks about, who has a vision, because these are visions that she's writing about. So she has visions of heaven and she has visions of hell, but she also has visions of purgatory as a particular place separate from. Now, there have been, people have written about purgatory as being a sort of place where people are waiting to get into heaven, or a place where people are waiting to be sent to hell. So it's sort of an adjunct to one of those two, but she's saying, no, it's a completely third place, where there is both suffering and hope, because the souls in purgatory know that their suffering is for the purpose of getting them into heaven. So this is something that will be made explicit in the Council of Lyon, which is not until 1274. So it's well after Hildegard's life, but but it's kind of based on her work of making this such a visual, compelling idea. It's kind of like today, someone making a movie about something, and all of a sudden, because somebody makes a movie, let's say about the Tulsa race riots, suddenly we all know about the Tulsa race riots because it's out there in that very graphic, accessible kind of form. And her visions were like that. They made religious ideas graphic and accessible to ordinary people. She also was a preacher, and she traveled all over Europe, in both to monasteries and convents, to both men's and women's religious communities, and also to cathedrals where she would be like a guest preacher. Yes, Anna.
Just real quick, the only people in purgatory are bound for heaven? Because
Yes.
the people going to hell are already going to hell.
Right.
Okay.
They have no opportunity to have that restorative process.
Can you go to purgatory and not make it and end up in hell according to these people?
I don't think so. And I think part of the deal is that when Jesus actually comes, at that point, purgatory's done. You know, and I guess maybe if you're still in purgatory by the time Jesus gets there, you could still go to hell. I don't know, but it's seen as a place where everybody eventually is going to be, you know, finish their sentence, so to speak, and then be brought into heaven. But how that fits with an actual expectation that Jesus might arrive and inaugurate, you know, a new heaven and a new earth, is really an interesting question. And I think what part of what purgatory shows you is how much the culture has given up on the expectation that Jesus is actually going to show. You know, I mean, that yes, if you ask them about it, they'd say, yes, of course that's going to happen, but it's not something that they're wandering around thinking about all the time. They're more concerned about, you know, how long is Uncle Joe scheduled to be in purgatory, and can I help him out with that? Okay, so we talked about her writing plays, and she writes a lot of liturgical music, and we call it plain song or plain chant. It's music that's intended to be sung by the nuns, the worshipers in the hours. Remember, we talked about the liturgical hours and this is she's a Benedictine, so they're doing the 5 times a day kind of worship process, and so she's composing music for them to sing, and specifically for women's voices, because that's who she's leading in worship at that time. So a couple of passages just to give you a sense of what this sounds like. She talks about, and all of these women have to justify their audacity in writing their own religious texts, their own stories, because who would want to care, you know, what your religious life was like, except that they feel like they've been given a message, you know, that in their visions, God or Jesus or the Virgin Mary talks to them and tells them stuff about how to be saved and how to live a pious life in the world. And so they feel like, as if they were prophets, you know, from the Hebrew scriptures, they've been sent with a message, and they have an obligation to deliver that message. So this is what that sounds like when Hildegard describes it in her book. She says, from my early childhood, before my bones, nerves, and veins were fully strengthened. So she doesn't just mean adolescence, she means early childhood. I have always seen this vision in my soul, even to the present time when I'm more than 70 years old. In this vision, my soul, as God would have it, rises up high into the vault of heaven and into the changing sky and spreads itself out among different peoples, although they are far away from me in distant lands and places. And because I see them this way in my soul, I observe them in accord with the shifting of clouds and other created things. I do not hear them with my outward ears, nor do I perceive them by the thoughts of my own heart or by any combination of my five senses, but in my soul alone, while my outward eyes are open. So she's making two claims here, one of which is that she's not, in fact, having hallucinations. She is not seeing things that aren't there. The way you would if you got conked on the head and all of a sudden you're hearing voices or seeing colors or something. It is not a physical effect that she's experiencing, but also she says, while my outward eyes are open, so I've never fallen prey to ecstasy in the visions, but I see them wide awake day and night. So there's also the suspicion that this person might suffer from epilepsy, or they might suffer from some sort of condition in which they fall unconscious and have experiences that are generated by their disease or their disability, which would not necessarily be from God. So she's trying to say, no, that I'm having this, but I'm awake. I know what's going on. I'm not seeing things. God is giving me this experience and telling me to report it to you. So I've never fallen prey to ecstasy in the visions, but I see them wide awake day and night. And another thing that people would often say, of course, and you get this in the Old Testament all the time, God came to them in a dream. Right? So they'll say, I had a dream in which God or Jesus or someone said to me, blah, blah, blah. And this is not held in great esteem by the 10th and 11th century Catholic Church. That they don't want to hear about your dreams. So she's like, no, I'm not dreaming. I'm wide awake, whether it's daytime or nighttime. And she says, and I am constantly fettered by sickness, and often in the grip of pain so intense that it threatens to kill me, but God has sustained me until now. So that's considered a verification that you really are having these visions because they cause you suffering. And nobody would do that voluntarily. You wouldn't go out looking for that. It has to be something that's being imposed on you by the divine. And then she continues, the light that I see is thus not spatial, but is far, far brighter than a cloud which carries the sun. And this is almost universal in these mystical visions that these women talk about light, indescribable, brilliant light. That's always a piece of it. I can measure neither height nor length nor breadth in it, and I call it the reflection of the living light. And this is another theme you'll often hear, that it's not the thing itself, it's a reflection of the thing. So that this message is not God's love, but it's a reflection of God's love. You're not looking at Jesus, you're looking at the reflection of Jesus. You're looking at a manifestation of the absolutely divine thing, because the divine thing itself cannot be looked at and cannot be described. And as the sun, the moon, and the stars appear in water, so again, reflection. So writings, sermons, virtues, and certain human actions take form for me and gleam. So she's partly saying my writings, my sermons, my decisions, I see them as if they were reflected on water. They sort of come to me as a whole. I'm not making them up, I'm just transcribing them. So that's her kind of defense of the credibility of her vision and of her writing it down. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. And so then the second passage is a quote of a message that God is sending to her. And again, this is the divine instruction that says you must communicate this. You cannot just sit on this and keep quiet. So God says to her, "O fragile human, ashes of ashes and filth of filth, say and write what you see and hear. But since you are timid in speaking and simple in expounding and untaught in writing, speak and write these things not by a human mouth and not by the understanding of human invention and not by the requirements of human composition, but as you see and hear them on high in the heavenly places in the wonders of God." So this is the response to the other criticism was of, well, this is an uneducated person. This person is not writing in Latin. This person does not have a knowledge of theology, as we would expect if we were taking a theologian seriously in the male academic world. We would expect him to have these abilities, right? And this woman has none of those. So why should we take her seriously? And she's kind of turning that argument on its head and saying, God says I don't need any of that. God doesn't want me to try to edit this according to academic standards. God is just telling me, just report what you see, report what you hear. Don't fancy it up, don't try to invent stuff or make it correspond to some sort of intellectual tradition, because it's not going to. Okay, explain these, and then he says, explain these things in such a way that the hearer, receiving the words of his instructor, may expound them in those words according to that will, vision, and instruction. So, in other words, you are communicating material that other people are going to use in spiritual instruction. So you want to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible so that the person who's using it can use it to instruct someone else. And thus, therefore, O humans, speak these things that you see and hear, and write them not by yourself or any other human being, which has to do with editors, because all these women will have male editors who will oversee the publication of their work. So she's saying the editor doesn't have to have any special credibility either, but by the will of him who knows, sees, and disposes all things in the secrets of his mysteries. So this is sort of one of the early arguments from a woman mystic as to what her qualifications are for putting out these ideas that she is going to have that are going to be somewhat different from the academic theological treatises, but are going to be, she thinks and God thinks, these are going to be helpful to simple people who are just trying to live a good, righteous life and have a connection with God. Now, this is over against the church in a couple of ways, because it's saying what you've been taught all these years is that there's a hierarchy and you need to go through the priest, and the priest needs to go through the bishop, and the bishop needs to go through the pope, and then the pope will talk with God, and then if there's a message, it'll come back down the other way, so there's this hierarchy of communication, and these women are saying, no, there is a direct connection that is possible between a person of simple but profound faith and God itself, the divine itself. And that may happen through Jesus. It may happen less often through Mary, but eventually it becomes just this overwhelming personal experience of transcendence and being caught up into the wholeness of God itself. And they have a more gender neutral, often, vision of what God is like, even though they will use the masculine pronoun it's not anthropomorphic in the same way that the church's more visual language is about men, really. Everybody's following? Kay, is that a question?
Yeah. How did she feel about the saints?
You know, there's not a lot in her writings about the saints. She's more focused on Jesus and God. But I think she would say the saints are people who had that same sense of immediate connection to God. The saints are the people who achieved that state. And so our task is not so much to venerate them as it is to imitate them, right? We are trying to have the same connection with God that the saints had. So their purpose is, they serve as a witness, that that's possible. And they may be able to, reading their stories might trigger your own sense of devotion, your own sense of connection. But that is not about the saint. The ultimate purpose is not the saint. The ultimate purpose is that connection with God. And it's even not, Jesus offers one of the, I think it's might be Mechtel, but anyway, one of them describes Jesus as a bridge. And she's this great image of that sin is a river, a raging river in a chasm that has separated humanity from God, from divinity. And Jesus is the bridge that has sort of spanned that divide over the river of sin, so that we can, through identifying with Jesus and through the worship of Jesus, we can cross over to get to God. So Jesus is important. They don't describe any of the other saints as being that bridge. Only Jesus, because he is fully human and fully divine, right, can function that way. They spend a lot of time contemplating Jesus, right? Being in the presence of Jesus. But the goal is not Jesus. The goal is what Jesus is a bridge to, which is the experience of the divine on the other side. And being completely absorbed in that, being lost in that. When you achieve that state, there's no more you as an individual. There's only that wholeness, that being completely present everywhere in creation at one time, kind of thing. And it doesn't last. You always wind up back in your cell or your, convent or wherever you are, but it's that moment of complete connection and identification. That's what you're going for. And that's what the saints get. That's their reward for their holiness, or that's the thing that they're out to achieve. But these ladies are not so much concerned with getting the saints to do favors for them or intercede for them, or some of the other kinds of saint-related practices that the church had. And some people really enjoyed, some people really liked that, because you could, it's sort of like in a polytheistic religion, you could pick the saint, the proper saint, for whatever thing it was you were trying to do, and pray to that saint, or make gifts to that saint or whatever. That's not the same kind of mysticism. Is that helpful in terms of?
Yeah. Did she cost the church a lot of money?
Who? Hildegard?
Yeah, by people not.
I see. Well,
things needing indulgences.
Not really, because she was, I mean, she cost the monks at Disenboard or whatever it was. I can never say that right. Disabodenburg, Saint Disabode. Those monks, that abbey was not happy when she and her followers left to form their own convent, because that did cost them money, you know, because pilgrims were coming to consult her and the ladies. So in a very specific way, yes, but in terms of the church as a whole, no. Now she did in a mild way what some others will do much more aggressively later on, criticize the church, you know, and this is part of the continuing tension between the monastic communities and what were called the secular clergy, that is to say the church hierarchy in the churches and cathedrals, the priests and bishops and so on. There's always a tension between those two groups, each accusing the other of corruption. You know, the church is saying, you know, we got all these monks and they're out there getting all these nuns pregnant and being lazy and drinking beer and, you know, not praying when they're supposed to pray, blah, blah, blah. And then you have the monks and nuns saying, here are all these parish priests, you know, they have 6 different parishes and they're never in any of them. And they're living these dissolute lives with mistresses and children and blah, blah, blah. So there's kind of an ongoing skepticism each of the other, right? And Hildegard and the women mystics are very much on the side of, here we are trying to live holy lives, and these people, these clergy, who have in many ways have control over us, who supervise our communities, they are nothing to write home about from a moral standpoint. You know, they have all these problems, they have all these corruptions, and you know, part of the reason why God is giving us these visions, why God is sending the messages through us, is because the hierarchical church is corrupt, right? The Pope isn't going to tell you this stuff, you know, it's going to have to come through this poor silly woman who can't even read and write. That's who God is going to give the message to, because that's how it's going to get through with clarity, you know, with disinterest, you know, without having somebody say, now how can we make money off of this? So the church felt criticized by them, but I don't think immediately they did not diminish the popularity of things like indulgences. And with someone like Hildegard, her vision of purgatory only upped the ante, you know, to make it more appealing to get poor Uncle Joe out of that place. So I don't think at this level they did. No. Yeah, Mike.
The women here, kind of the early on proto ideas that ended up in the Reformation that the men took credit for, or
bingo. Well, yeah,
I mean, kind of the outliers in the monasteries. And number 2, since you said you couldn't read and write, was all this stuff being written down by someone in the native languages, or local, or Latin? Well, chants and all that information she was generating.
I mean, that was a hyperbole. There were women mystics who could not read and write, and their visions, their writings are dictated. Hildegard of Bingen could read and write in Latin, so she's not in that far down the scale, but some of them were, or claimed to be at least, illiterate. Yeah, Peggy.
I don't know how accurate it is, but the image that I was going to show you from one of her manuscripts from the Liber Scivias shows her having a vision and these sort of rays coming down from heaven into her head. And there's a monk next to her. His name is Volmer, and he has all these wax tablets stacked up, and he's trying to write as fast as he can as she's sort of speaking these visions. Now, I have no idea if that was reality or just this metaphor for the idea of her having visions, but apparently this was a real guy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Monk who was her assistant.
Right. Every single one of these women has a male sponsor, and often it's their confessor, who does the actual physical process of getting them published, because they would never be published. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Oh,
I was going to suggest, Peggy, could you send those?
that's
to
a
us?
different one. That's not the image I had, but it's the same.
It's the same idea.
Sure, I can email you the.
Yeah, if you email them to all of us.
Sure. Well, I've already emailed it to Kendall, and she's got all of our email addresses. I don't.
I can,
I really guess I do.
I can send it
But-
when we're done here. I don't want to stop and
But
play with
these are,
that because I might lose you,
but those are copies. The ones that I have are facsimiles from like late 1920s, 30s, because the Liber Scivias was destroyed during World War II, right? So these were made.
It disappeared during World War
Okay,
II. It was taken away for safekeeping, and it never reappeared.
And fortunately, the nuns at her abbey had just made this beautiful copy, precise, and so it's in pristine condition.
Right. But it's much more modern. So we assume it's lost. I mean, surely someone would have produced it by now if it was still in existence. But the idea was that someone was going to take it somewhere secret and, keep it safe from the Nazis and the bombs and everything, and then it disappeared. So but we do have what we believe is a pretty faithful copy, which is great because it has all her paintings and stuff too. So there is the concept, and this goes back to remember Muhammad, may or may not have been literate himself, so he has to dictate his revelations, and his are oral rather than visual, but the same thing. He has to talk and someone else has to write it down. So that happens with a number of these women too. We do believe that Hildegard revised her own work. In some cases, the women just gave their revelations or narrated their visions, and then the person who was their scribe or their editor took it from there. We know that, for instance, Hildegard illustrated her own book. So she was able to be more involved in finishing it than some of the others were. She also wrote a lot of letters. All of them do that. And by write, I mean, in some cases, dictate. But she entertained a large correspondence, and we know that because of her travels, that she was constantly writing to the places where she was going to, or the places she had been, to arrange her travels. And so we have many of her letters, and also letters to the priests and the bishops and the people who were in charge of whether or not she had permission to do X, Y, and Z, or her community did. Okay, so I just want you to get an image of how accomplished this woman was. I mean, she's running first 1 and then 2 and then 3 different convents out of, she's the administrator, she's the chief executive officer, while she's writing music and writing plays and writing letters and traveling all over and guest preaching, and doing medical observations, and then also having these divine visions, and not always being well, as many women weren't in those days. Yasu. You are muted.
Elle held up something, or Elle did, held up something earlier, and I wondered if it was relevant.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Al, did you hold up something? What you got? You're muted also.
That was listed as something that she had, it's called Work Guts. So it must be one of her illustrations, perhaps?
That looks like kind of a map of the universe, maybe, kind of thing.
Yeah. Another one.
Yeah. These are the kinds of things that they would often describe as seeing in the visions. You know, it's everything that was like a great circle, and it had this kind of light and that kind of, you know, this and that.
Where did you get that, Elle?
I Googled and then went to images.
Yeah. Yes, Anna.
So Hildegard was never enclosed. She worked for someone who was, and then when her person died, she was not, she did not follow that.
That's right. That's right.
She traveled, right?
Right. And well, and at that point, she had collected a community. I think there were 10 of them or something like that, that looked to her as their leader. So if she herself had chosen to be enclosed, I think that would have dispersed that community. You know, and I mean, maybe they could have stuck together, but they, you know, she would have become like Q or something, you know. I mean, it would have been very hard to have her remain the active leader of the community. And I don't think her spirituality was not inclined to enclosure. You know, she was a much more worldly person and creative and efficient and constructive in a sense of building communities. And so I don't think it would have suited her at all. But she did, at that point, she said, I don't want to be, because I don't think they had a central residence in Bodenberg. There was just the central cell that their mentor was in, and then they all lived around in the community kind of thing. And so if they were going to be a real convent, they had to go somewhere where there was a place that they could all live together. And I guess they didn't have a sponsor at that point that was willing to build them something right there. So it was easier to go find an old disused monastery and put it back together again. And it wasn't that far away, but it was far enough away that they weren't going to attract the pilgrims to this little backwater monastery anymore. So. Okay, I want to talk a little bit this now. Hildegard is German, and the next woman that I want to talk about also is German. And Mechthild of Magdeburg is Begin, which, if you remember from last time, that means she was never. We don't believe she was ever an avowed nun. She was never an official member of a recognized religious community. And we know she lived most of her life as a Begin. The question will come at the very end. She is literate, but not in Latin. So she knows how to read and write in what's called Middle Low German. Which is basically the vernacular language. She grew up in a reasonably wealthy family. And we know that in part because she uses the conventions of romance and courtly love as analogies for the soul's relationship with God. And so what that means is she was exposed to those ideas presumably in her family of origin. And that meant that they had the leisure for things like reading novels. She decides at the age of 23 that she is not in the market for a marriage. I think she probably has been coming to that conclusion for some time, because that would have been late to be getting married in those days. But she actually leaves her parents' home and joins, becomes a beguine, undertakes her own support, and joins the movement at the age of 23. Now, at the very end of her life, she becomes blind. And at that point, she goes to live in a convent in a place called Helka, to be a teacher, sort of a scholar in residence, or a mystic in residence, if you will, for the nuns there. And they take care of her then for the rest of her life. It's not impossible that she at some point formally joined that order very late in her life, but we don't think so. She certainly did not live the majority of her life or do her work as a nun. She did it as a self-supporting beguine. And she also has a male editor who helps to give her credibility. And she does the same kind of self-effacing, I'm nobody. I just happen to have these visions from God, and he wants me to tell you about them. And my confessor, my editor, wants me to tell you about them. So therefore I will, because I've been instructed to. So what could be an act of self-assertion becomes recast as an act of obedience. And that's how a woman can get away with this kind of thing. But the same idea that she is not inventing this, she didn't dream it, she didn't make it up, she isn't just nuts and hearing voices, but this is really a message from God. And this is, she particularly makes the point that it is the unlearned, the non-academic experience that allows you to teach what comes to you from the Holy Spirit with authority, and that the holy life is really a simple life. You don't need to be the Pope and live in a big palace and have lots of fancy robes and assistants and all that in order to live the way God is inviting human beings to live. And she was particularly sharp about the corruption of the church hierarchy, that these are people who allegedly are supposed to be the servants of God and the servants of other people, the servants of the people of God. And instead they're running around trying to accumulate power and wealth and exploiting the poor and doing all these very ungodly things. And she thinks that should be corrected. She also uses imagery, as we'll see here in a moment, of the erotic to describe the journey of the soul to God, and also the relationship between the church and God as the bride of Christ, that imagery. And if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, Marguerite Porete was another beguine who was condemned for heresy, and she was locked up for like 18 months or something, during which she refused to have any conversation with the folks who had accused her of heresy, which were the men of the institutional church. And ultimately she was burned at the stake because they couldn't get her to plead to anything. So the question becomes, why wasn't Mechthild burned at the stake? I mean, they were kind of more or less contemporaries. They were teaching a lot of the same things. And as far as we can see, what saves her is, first of all, that claim to humility, that the sort of formal allegation that, well, I would never have written this if I hadn't been instructed to by men, basically, by the hierarchy of the church, that keeps it from being an act of disobedient self-assertion. And then also her writings are very popular because they're in the vernacular. They're accessible to any literate person in her realm. And so, and they're pretty sexy in some ways. And so they are well received. And so for the church to have tried to do away with her would have created a PR problem. Well, let's put it that way. And then also, again, she has a male editor, and actually he tones down some of her imagery. And this is one example and not the most egregious. This is a poem of hers called "The Soul Speaks to God." And God said to the soul, I desired you before the world began. I desire you now as you desire me. And where the desires of two come together, there love is perfected. How the soul speaks to God. Lord, you are my lover, my longing, my flowing stream, my son, and I am your reflection. There's that reflection image again. How God answers the soul. It is my nature that makes me love you often, for I am love itself. It is my longing that makes me love you intensely, for I yearn to be loved from the heart. It is my eternity that makes me love you long. I have no end. So there's that sort of when the soul is united with God, it is passionate. And it's passionate in a way that most human understanding would ascribe to sexuality. But this is kind of a sublimated sexuality that is trying to describe the nature of God. Okay, and again, this is a woman who, unlike Hildegard, she's not in charge of anything. She's not an institution builder, but she's also not, she won't subject herself to an institution either. She's just an independent force and an independent source of these writings, these visions that she's putting out there about the nature of God. Then we have Julian of Norwich. Let me wait, I should see if any questions arising from that. Okay. Julian of Norwich is a woman who was herself an anchorite. She was enclosed. And we don't know very much about her early history. We're guessing at her birth date because we're subtracting 30 from the year in which she was enclosed, because she says that when she was 30, she had this severe illness, and out of that illness arose the visions, and that was what caused her to want to be enclosed. So we're assuming if you count back 30 years, that's about when she was born. So there's argument about whether it should be 1343 or 1342, but somewhere in there. And we're also guessing about her death date. All we know is that in 1416, she is mentioned in an independent document as being alive. So she died sometime after that, but we don't know exactly when because there are no records. Okay, and we also don't know her birth name, which makes it then hard to look for information about when she might have been born, because she was enclosed at the Church of St. Julian in Norwich. And so she becomes known as Julian of Norwich, which may just be because that's the name of the church, right? It may have nothing to do with what her name was originally. Okay, so she has this, the report in her book that she's going to write is that she has this severe illness and everybody thinks she's going to die, including herself. And so the priest comes to give her the last rites, and he brings with him a crucifix, and he shows her the crucifix. And in her sort of semi-conscious state, this triggers a series of visions and revelations for her. And then she does not die. In fact, she gets better. And she then writes down everything she can remember of these visions. And she wants to figure out what they mean. She wants to be able to explore what God is trying to tell her in each of these revelations that she remembers from that time when she was sick, that period of several hours. And so she figures that the way to get the freedom to do that is to be enclosed. So she is going to become an anchorite at the Church of St. Julian. And that's a very interesting process. It goes back to the sort of eremitic ideal like we talked about before, and the fact that especially urban women are not going to achieve that in the same way that men do. So there's enough structure to this that it has to be approved by the bishop. You can't just go decide that you're going to be enclosed and go do it. So the bishop is going to look at a number of things, one of which is, are you just plain crazy? Because that is not the object of the exercise, is to deal with crazy people. But the other question is, do you have the wherewithal to live as an enclosed person? Which is to say, can you provide the money that will support you in this for the rest of your life? And what that means is you've got to have the money to provide your food and to provide, whatever other supplies or books or whatever you're going to want, as well as a person to bring you that stuff. You got to have someone who connects you to the outside world, which is what I think Hildegard was doing for this woman who was originally her mentor. So obviously, Julian, as we will come to know her, had that. She had the resources to be able to say, here, church, you can have this money and that will pay for my servant and my upkeep for the rest of my life as I live in this enclosed. Now, it wasn't an expensive way to live, obviously, but you had to have something. So then they do this. What you do is you build a little shed, basically, a three-sided room attached to the wall of the cathedral. And either where there already is a window, or you make a window, you cut out a space in the stone wall of the cathedral so that you can see in, because you want to be able to see the altar and you want to be able to receive communion in this room. And so there's a window into the church. There's a window into some other sheltered space where your servant, your attendant, can come and bring your food and your books and all that stuff, and not be standing out in the rain while they're trying to hand it to you. And then there's a third window that is out into the public, either into the street or into a courtyard where anybody can come, where they can come and consult you as a holy wise person and ask for your advice. You become sort of the dear Abbey of the community as you live there in contemplation in this room. And so it's not a big room. Somebody said 12 by 12, which actually may be a bigger room than some people would have had in that day. But you have a bed, you have a little writing desk, and you have an altar where you can pray. Some of them actually had a dugout space that would be the person's grave, so that when they died, they just got moved into that hole, which was there the whole time, and covered over, and that's where they were buried. And that was part of the spiritual practice, that you lived by your grave where you knew you would be when you died. And the whole thing's, yes, Anna.
Would someone else later use the same enclosure?
Perhaps or perhaps not. I think a lot of times they were either torn down or bricked up once the person who had been there died. But I bet there's an example somewhere where somebody else moved into it too. They didn't all have the built-in grave. That was just some of them had that. And some of them had a door that was just normally locked. Some of them were actually bricked up. That was part of the ritual of enclosure, that once you went in, the doorway was bricked up. Now, obviously, I think you could still get out the windows if the place was burning down or something, but the idea was that you were never going to leave that space again. Some of them actually had a little tiny walled courtyard or garden that where you could actually get outside for fresh air. Not all of them. And one of the things I love about it is that many of the women anchoresses had cats, because the cat could like come and go out the windows, and so they at least had the company of their cat. Oh, and then the other thing about this I think is so fascinating. You think this would be lonely, but actually these anchor holds, is what they were called, often functioned as kind of the local post office, in that because nobody could easily break in, people could bring you mail that someone else could then come and get from you. They could actually bring you money that would be safe there until someone else came and picked it up, or that person themselves came back and got it. People could tell you stuff, leave messages, I mean, even if it wasn't a written down message, for other people, so that it became kind of like, we might go online, to find out what's happening. Well, you could sort of get the local news by going down and talking to Julian, because she knew what was going on with everybody. Or other objects, if you wanted to leave your grandfather's harmonica or whatever, for your nephew to come and get. It was a safe place because the anchorists had nothing to gain. I mean, what were they going to do? What were they going to spend the money on? How would they sell it? And nobody else could get in. And so it became this place of public exchange, and they really had very lively relationships with a lot of the people in the town who came to consult them or converse with them or bring them a book or whatever, there were lots of relationships continued, even though the person was enclosed. But it was also one of the few places where you might ever be alone in medieval life, especially for a woman. Even in a convent, the women's religious life had less of an aromatic tendency. So the convents were much more about community. They were much more about, you lived in a dormitory and you never went anywhere by yourself, because that was one of the ways of minimizing corruption and danger for women. So even in a convent setting, you were never alone, or almost never alone. So this is one of the few ways of really ensuring any kind of substantial time for personal introspection, reflection, prayer, whatever you want to call it. So this is what Julian was doing when she was enclosed. She was taking those revelations that she had had during that illness and unpacking them, just exploring them over and over and over again. What was God trying to tell her through these visions that she had had? And we tend to be more familiar with her work, probably partly because it was in English, although the English it was in is not very familiar to us. So we still have to translate a little to get a sense of what she's saying. But at least it wasn't German or Latin. So these are just some passages that appeal even to sort of, I think, the modern sensibility about mystic spirituality. So she says, all this he showed me full blissfully, signifying thus. So she's recorded a section of her revelations, and now she's saying, this is what God means by this. See, I am God. See, I am in all things. See, I do all things. See, I never lift my hands off my works, nor ever shall without end. See, I lead all things to the end. I ordained it too from without beginning. by the same might, wisdom, and love whereby I made it. How should anything be amiss? And this is her whole insight, is that everything, God made everything, and therefore everything must be good. And evil is only that which doesn't exist, which takes away or deprives existence. Every actual thing and being is good. And then the most famous quote is, she says, in my folly before this time, I often wondered why the great foreseeing wisdom of God, in the great foreseeing wisdom of God, the beginning of sin was not prevented. For then methought all should have been well. In other words, why did God let sin happen in the first place? Right? This idea was much to be ignored. She says it's a bad idea. I shouldn't have been thinking like this, but nevertheless, mourning and sorrow I made therefore without reason or discretion. So this was something she wondered about before she had this revelation, but now it got solved for her. But Jesus, who in this vision informed me of all that is needful to me, answered by this word and said, it behooved that there should be sin, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. So that's the famous quote that many people know from her work, that sort of assurance that in the providence of God, everything is going to be okay. And the soul can rest in that assurance. Okay, any other questions about Julian? There's a lovely little folk song about her. All right. Finally, I want to finish real quickly with Catherine of Siena, who is an Italian. And her book is called The Dialogue of Divine Providence. And this is, again, the format is a conversation between the soul and God about what God has provided. Now, Catherine was an activist. She was one of the people who advocated for Pope Gregory to return to Rome and advocated obedience to Urban VI after he was elected. She was the 22nd child in a family of 25, if you can imagine that. And she grows up during the years of plague. She's born the year before the first plague hits Italy. But it came back repeatedly over the next couple of decades. And there was a particularly bad outbreak in 1373, which affects her. Let's see. As a very young child, she has mystical experiences of the presence of Jesus and the apostles, and they just appear to her. By 16, she's getting pressure from her family to get married. And so she does this very dramatic gesture of cutting off all her lovely hair so that she will be less appealing to suitors. And they have a particular guy in mind who was married to one of her sisters, and the sister died in childbirth. So they're like, okay, well, how about the next one? But she's not having it. So she goes on a fast. And she gets ill, and they're afraid she's going to die. And so finally they say, okay, fine. She wants to move into the basement where she's going to live basically as if it was a monastery or a convent, and serve the family. You know, it's interesting. She doesn't initially want to leave. She just wants to be allowed, I mean, basically the space of her own. This is how desperate you can be to have a space of your own. To pursue her religious inclinations and to serve her family. So she starts, one of her first visions is she envisions her mother as the Virgin Mary, which after 25 kids, that's got to be a stretch. I forget who her father was. It wasn't Jesus, but then her brothers are all the apostles. And so she's going to do this spiritual practice of serving her family as if they were these holy people. But then when she's 19, I guess they decide at that point that she's free to do what she wants. And what she wants to do is become what's called a third order Dominican, which is sort of like a lay woman who hasn't taken vows, but she's still a follower of the Dominican practice. And so they're said to be mantellata, or those who have taken the mantle. So she becomes a mantellate and becomes active in ministry to the poor, and especially those who are sick during the plague outbreak of 1373. She becomes very renowned for her piety, and again, she attracts a popular following, and she begins to correspond with Gregory XI. In the summer of 1376, she actually goes off to where? To visit the Pope. Where would you go in 1376 to visit the Pope?
Paris.
Nope, not quite. Almost.
But the French, would have been the French
France.
Pope.
Right. Avignon, right?
Avignon.
Right. He's not in Rome, he's in Avignon. And she is convinced that this is in part responsible for the outbreak of the plague and the corruption of the church, that the Pope isn't where he belongs, because he belongs in Rome. So she's been corresponding with him. She goes to visit him. She gives him a lot of time about going back to Rome. And she's praying for this, and she's asking everybody else to pray that he's going to go back to Rome. He ultimately agrees to do that, as we know, and he barely gets there when he thinks he's made a mistake, and then he dies. So that she is an advocate for his successor, and she is kind of a diplomat that Urban, what was his name? The sixth, Urban the Sixth, who is one of the successors, the Roman successor, right, to Gregory. She gets sent to, particularly to Florence. Florence had a particularly bad relationship with the Pope in Avignon, and has a particularly bad relationship with the guy who becomes Urban before he's even Pope. And so she travels around Europe doing these kind of diplomatic missions, trying to persuade Catholics to get their ducks in a row, because she's afraid that the church is going to kind of fall apart, which it turns out in a few hundred years, she's right, right, that is going to happen. She is only 33 when she dies. And one of the lessons that she took from her childhood and her family is that you can get people to do stuff by refusing to eat. So one of the things she does with the Pope is to say, well, I'm going to fast until you move back to Rome. And then she does the same thing with the Florentines. I'm going to fast until you make up with the Pope. And so when she dies, one could argue that she has an eating disorder, basically. And when she dies, it may be as a consequence of that. Or it may also be that she had some kind of disease or condition that made it very difficult for her to eat, that she's just really severe digestive problems, and that she died of that. And one of the symptoms was that she couldn't eat. And it's hard to know at this point, but that is what happens to her. But she has, I love this little prayer that she does for the Pope. This is great. She's praying to God, and she says to God, I see that you have endowed your vicar by nature with a fearless heart. So I humbly, imploringly beg you to pour the light beyond nature into the eye of his understanding. For unless this light, acquired through pure affection for virtue, is joined with it, a heart such as his tends to be proud. Today, again, let every selfish love be cut away from those enemies of yours and from the vicar and from us all, so that we may be able to forgive those enemies when you bend their hardness. For them, that they may humble themselves and obey this Lord of ours, I offer you my life from this moment, and for whenever you wish me to lay it down for your glory. So this is stuff that she is writing ostensibly as a prayer for the Pope, but of course she's sending it to the Pope, saying, here's how I'm praying for you. So she's getting her message across in the format of her prayers and her visions and her fasting, to try to achieve the political outcome that she's interested in. Yes, Anna.
So unlike the other three, she was more interested in saving the church. She was working to bring the church back into strength and together than these independent women.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I think they were all interested in strengthening the church. They were interested in getting rid of the corruption. But you know, I mean, Catherine criticized the corruption just as much as anybody else. They all wanted a strong church. But they also had their vision of what that looked like, right? But none of them would have been supporters of the Reformation, even though some of their ideas would be manifested in the Reformation. They would have all been horrified by the actual idea that there could be more than one church, you know, or that it wouldn't be the universal Catholic Church. That was the only thing they knew. That, as far as they knew, that was who and what God was. So I would say they were all in that same position. But I mean, this is a woman who's willing to ride into the papal palace and say, it's your fault that we're this screwed up. Why don't you go back to Rome? I mean, she was very assertive about, you know, what she thought needed to happen. And as far as she was concerned, if it was what God wanted, then never mind what the Pope wants. You know, I mean, that should be the last thing to be said. Yeah. So you know, we've talked so much about the sort of political and economic agenda that people had. And these were women whose agenda really was helping people to live spiritually satisfying and wise and moral kinds of lives through their Catholic faith. And if the church in its hierarchy and its self-interest and its splendor wasn't doing that, then maybe something different was needed, which was their style of sort of direct revelation of God's love. And however cheesy or erotic or feminine they had to be in expressing that, that sense of love and assurance and connection and mystical absorption was more at the heart of what it meant to be Catholic than building cathedrals or accumulating secular power and being in conflict with the political authorities. So I just felt like that was kind of a good antidote to look at that as opposed to some of the other forces we've been looking at. Okay. Anything in particular that's occurred to you that you would like to talk about next week? If not, I'll just get us as close as I can to the Reformation so that we're ready to jump off into that in the fall. And then everybody has to come up with something for the 30th that you want to know more about. All right, that's going to be our question box. So I will see you all next week.
One of the biggest things I've learned from this class is that it wasn't just one central thing, and that so much culture happened because of the differences.